This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, 20, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we'll get back to our focus on Nazi Germany, and in particular, the ways in which Hitler made his dictatorship popular. Now, I know at a certain level, saying that dictatorship was popular probably sounds a little strange to most of you. After all, we're talking here not just about some kind of generic dictatorship, where, okay, as long as you don't criticize the regime, you're probably going to be fine, right? Maybe you won't have all the political rights, but, it's not going to be so bad. We're talking about Nazis here. And for good reason. Nazis are known for their brutality, their inhumanity. They're known for the concentration camps and the racism and the anti-Semitism, of the frequent and public acts of violence, not only against minorities, by the way, but as we saw during the episode on the Night of the Long Knives, they also carry out violence against their own party members, their own supporters. So who on earth would want to live in this dark world? How on earth could the Nazi dictatorship be popular? For many Germans living in the 1930s, however, the Nazi Germany that they experienced was not one characterized primarily by repression. Now, of course, this violence and repression exists. It is very public. But for many of them, the word that they would probably have used to describe life in Nazi Germany, at least before 1939, was actually the word empowered. Now, again, I know that probably sounds like a pretty crazy thing to say. Most of us would say, well, wait a minute, if you take away all of my political rights and you take away my legal rights, that's kind of the opposite of empowerment. But as we'll see in today's episode, the idea of freedom can be understood in other ways than just the Anglo-American obsession with what the government is legally preventing you from doing or allowing you to do. For example, do you have enough money to provide for your family? Can you feed them tonight? Maybe so, but what about next week? How confident are you that you will be able to use some of your perhaps limited resources to do something other than just to survive? Survival is great. We all love surviving, but surviving, just barely getting through each day, that doesn't necessarily lead to contentness. It doesn't necessarily make people happy. And even if you have enough money to eat, how confident are you that the food that you can afford will be nutritious, that it'll be free of toxins or carcinogens? Do you survive today by sacrificing your health for tomorrow? If that's the case, would you say that you really live in freedom just because you're getting, your basic needs met, but that's it? Do you feel like you're being treated equally in society? Do you have access to the same goods or services or careers or even just experiences that other people do? If you work hard, how confident are you that you will be able to move up or at least stay in the same place on the proverbial social ladder? That you will be treated fairly as you go through life in terms of your work experiences? Is the dream of social mobility and economic prosperity one that is actually open to you? To what extent do you get to decide what happens in your life versus circumstances forcing you to do the things that you don't want to do, but you basically just have to do? if you think about some of the kind of worst careers out there, the hardest things to do, are you someone that chose to do that because, hey, maybe you just like, the physical work, maybe you like the challenges, maybe you like the danger, or is that the only options available to you? Do you really have freedom if your life is kind of predetermined in terms of what jobs, what careers are available to you? Now, of course, some people don't care about the social ladder, and that's totally fine. Not everybody has to go to college. Not everybody has to try to, buy $1 million house. But even if you don't envision changing social classes, do you still have the opportunity, one could ask, to experience the good life? Can you buy the material things that make you happy? Whether that's something like a new bedroom set, a TV, some kind of decoration or artwork for the wall. Do you have a car? And if so, is it a car that you said, oh, this is something that I really like? I like my truck. I like my Jeep. I always wanted to drive whatever type of car it was. Or are you forced to take whatever the most basic thing is that you can get, right? You didn't have a choice because of economic circumstances. Do you have money for experiences? Can you take a vacation? If so, do you get to travel where you want to? Do you get to say, well, really, I want to go to the beach, or I want to go to a mountain, or I want to go even to something as small as a movie or a concert? These, one could argue, are all non-legal ways of measuring the concept of freedom. You may have the legal right to go to a Chris Stapleton concert. Wonderful, awesome. But that doesn't mean that you can actually afford to do it. This past summer, you may have legally had the right to buy a ticket and go to the World Cup. Yay, awesome, freedom. But as many of us found out, we can't afford $4,000 tickets, especially for nosebleed seats at a World Cup match. I had the freedom in the traditional kind of Anglo-American sense to go to a World Cup match, but economically, I really didn't have the freedom to do it, right? Because I was priced out of it. So to bring this back to the question of Germans in the 1930s and the Nazi dictatorship, unfortunately, for many ordinary Germans, when they think about the question of freedom during the Weimar era, in a time period where they've suffered through World War I, they've suffered through hyperinflation, they've suffered through the Great Depression. When they think about the concept of freedom, they're not thinking about it in these abstract legal terms, or at least it's not their primary sort of focus. They're thinking about it much more in these kind of lived experiential ways. Do I have the actual ability to control my life? And the answer for many of them, unfortunately, is no. And so again, as we think about the idea of Nazi society and this question of Hitler's popularity, one of the arguments that I want to make to you today is that the Nazis built genuine support for the dictatorship after 1933 by making many ordinary Germans' lives seem better. And not, I might add, just by improvements in the general economic conditions. We saw that in our last episode on Nazi Germany. That was an important factor, right? Recovering from the Great Depression. But as we'll talk about today, the Nazis also engaged in specific, targeted social welfare programs that signaled to working and middle-class Germans that the party and its leadership cared deeply about their well-being. And so again, if we want to understand the totality of what the Nazis did and how they were sort of, at least initially, politically successful, how they got away with destroying German democracy, we have to widen our understanding of what the word freedom means and how people directly experience freedom. And so if you're a political junkie, I think you're really going to find today's episode most interesting, most stimulating, especially I know some of you love to learn about the past because you think about the present. If we're trying to understand the present moment that global society is really going through, part of it, I would argue, is trying to understand the experience of what ordinary people are going through, as opposed to just the abstract concept of political rights or even economic rights. Now, just a quick note before we get started. This is one of over a dozen episodes that we've now done on Nazi society. We also have episodes on other historical topics, ranging from the French Revolution to a deep dive into the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You can find a complete list of these episodes on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. We also have some reading recommendations there as well. And if that's not enough for you, we also have, as of July 2026, 8 Patreon-only episodes on topics like the making of Hitler, the rise of the SS, and most recently, a 2 to 3 part series. It's going to be 3 parts. Right now, there's only 2, but a 3-part series on the history of Auschwitz-Birkenau. You can access these episodes for as little as $2 a month via the website Patreon. If you're not familiar with Patreon, just Google that and History Off the Page, and it will take you right to the landing spot. And there you can sign up. And again, it supports us for a minimum of $2 a month. This helps us pay for the expenses that keep the podcast running. So to those of you who have already signed up for Patreon, thank you so much. Without your generosity, we couldn't keep the podcast going. Finally, just a quick editorial note here. This episode ended up being a little bit longer than I had originally anticipated. It actually came out close to 2 hours. So instead of kind of loading you up with a giant supersized episode, I decided to split it into 2. This is the first half of that lecture. The second will be released as a separate episode in about 2 weeks. All right, let's get back to the history. And I want to start today's episode by talking about Volkswagen, or in the German pronunciation, Volkswagen. Volkswagen is, of course, today one of the world's leading auto manufacturers. But did you know that Volkswagen was not only launched in Nazi Germany, but that it was basically a Nazi concept itself? Indeed, as I'll argue, Volkswagen was actually a key device for building popular support for Hitler's dictatorship. Now, if you happen to own a Volkswagen right now, please don't drive off the road. Please don't freak out. While the Nazis kind of come up with the concept of the Volkswagen, the modern VW is really born after World War II. The Nazis never really put it into major production. By the time that they're kind of ready to do this in the early 1940s, World War II is raging, and so they kind of devote all of their production resources towards the war effort. Now, the word Volkswagen, as some of you know, translates to the people's car. And again, this language reflects this Nazi ideology in the sense that it's supposed to make the car available to everyone, to the people. Now, before 1933, at least outside of the United States, very few people actually own cars. In 1935, for example, only 16 of every 1,000 Germans owns a car. In France and the United Kingdom, that number is about in the 40s, so about 40 to 45 people out of every 1,000 own a car. In Italy, which is a little bit more rural, that number was 9.5 people.
Stay with us. We'll be right back. History Analyzed is a podcast which explains in convincing detail how Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, how Columbus changed the world, why Neville Chamberlain was right, that the sole cause of the Civil War was slavery, how Hernan Cortez conquered the Aztec Empire, and explains the tragedies of the Dust Bowl, the Irish potato famine, and the Black Death. History Analyzed covers many more subjects. You can find History Analyzed on all podcast apps. I'm the host, Mark Palmer, asking you to please give History Analyzed a try. Thank you.
Just to give you a little bit of contemporary perspective, today in Germany, about 590 people per 1,000 own an automobile. So to own a car in the 1930s is very different. It is not just about the idea of owning a car. It is, in many ways, a status symbol. It's a sign of wealth. If you've ever seen the show Downton Abbey, which is basically about these British aristocrats, and it starts with the sinking of the Titanic and the ways in which they're going to experience World War I and this kind of transition to modernity, one of the episodes depicts the moment when the family gets its first car. And the car is not something necessary. It's not something that they really need to get around, but it is this kind of exciting, shiny new toy for them. These are the type of people who own cars in the 1920s. It is not a farmer. It is not a factory worker. It is the aristocrats, the bankers, the people who own the factories, perhaps. In short, we're talking about the elite that own cars in Europe in the 1920s. So if you want to make a kind of modern equivalency, don't think about the idea of just do you own a car, but do you have a driver? Are you the type of person, or is your family wealthy enough that you have a personal driver for your car? That's more the way that people thought about cars in the 1920s, at least outside of the United States, than it is the kind of modern conception. So again, the key point here, a car or owning a car is a status symbol. It is a sign, a declaration in many ways to your neighbors, I am elite, I have money, I have power. I guess another analogy would be like saying, can you afford a $4,000 designer purse? Right? What's the point of spending $4,000 on a purse if you could just spend $40 on a knockoff handbag that's functionally the same? Right? It's about declaring who you are. You have money, you have power, you have status. Now, when it comes to cars, we should recognize that there's so much more than just a form of status. Because at a more fundamental level, one could argue that owning a car is one of the ultimate sort of signs or the ultimate sort of achievements of freedom. Because at a more fundamental level, one could argue that owning a car is a type of freedom in and of itself. Now, when I talk to my students about this in lecture, I have a really great example that I think illustrates the point that a car equals freedom. For many of my students, when they first come to campus, they are freshmen, they're kind of learning the ropes, they're kind of taking everything in, and so a lot of them don't bring a car with them. And so how does that affect your life if you don't have a car, or let's say by extension, you don't have a friend with a car either? Usually that means taking public transportation. Sometimes it might even mean, God forbid, walking or biking to wherever you want to go. But basically what the students kind of talk about is they say, well, look, when I don't have my own car, I am tied to other people's schedules. My freedom of movement is limited by the needs and desires of other people, or I guess in the age of Uber, you could take an Uber somewhere and you can schedule when you want it, but then you also have to pay for that. So it's limited by economic factors as well. And as you might expect a 19-year-old kid to do, a lot of them say, hey, I feel frustrated. It's annoying to have to wait for my roommate to be done working out for me to go to the grocery store so I can get food that I want, or to go to the mall or to the movie or whatever they want to do. One of the things that we as adults love is that we have the ability to control, especially if we own a car, a lot of our time. We can decide, where do we want to go? When do we want to go? How long do we want to be there? And essentially, this freedom of movement is what having a car establishes. Are you a night owl? Do you want to stay out late? Do you want to eat dinner late, go to a restaurant or something? If you have a car, no problem. You don't need to wait at the bus or deal with the subway. I take students to Europe sometimes. We go to places like Paris, places like Brussels, and they want to stay out all night drinking. Okay, they're fine, they're young. But then they stay out past when the metro closes. And now they have a problem because their freedom of movement is tied to someone else's schedule. Once you become an adult especially, some of you will encounter times where you have to move something big and heavy. Maybe it's something like furniture. Maybe it's lumber. Maybe it's junk that you're hauling to the trash. If you are doing this on a personal level, that is very difficult. If I have to carry around giant pieces of lumber, walk home with them, or ride the bus with them, that's not really practical, is it? But if I have a car, or if I have a truck, I just put it in the back of my pickup truck and I drive away. People sometimes like to dunk on pickup trucks as not being necessary, but when you have to haul something, pickup trucks are really, really helpful. They are, in some ways, a form of freedom. If you want to go someplace far away, if you want to go to someplace that is not served by the public transportation links, or that there isn't a bike path to, or that's not close enough for you to walk to it, guess what? If you own a car, chances are you can go there. I talked about people dunking on trucks a second ago. One of the reasons that I think they do this is the car commercials. If you ever watch truck commercials, they love driving up mountains. And then they show you the truck, and the truck, they've probably airlifted it actually to the top of the mountain, but they show the truck on the top of the mountain, and it's like, when would you ever do that? Why would you ever need to drive your pickup truck up like a 7,000 foot mountain peak? And of course, you never would. It's not practical. It's not necessary. It's not really probably even enjoyable to take your nice $100,000 truck up a mountain. So why do ad agencies keep doing this? It's because it's about the idea that the truck, and by extension, the car, is freedom. You can go where you want to go. You don't have limits. This is one reason one could argue why Americans love cars. And this is also, one could argue, a reason that so many Germans living in the 1930s wanted a car. If you go to Germany even today, there's lots of spaces that you don't need a car. If you live in a city, you don't really need a car. In most parts of Europe, one could argue. But it sure is nice to have one, right? It sure is that sense again of freedom. To bring all this back to the question of Nazism then, in 1934, Adolf Hitler began to envision the mass production of a cheap automobile that would be available to not just the elite, not even just the middle classes, not even just to what the market could provide, but to ordinary working class Germans, of course, at least quote unquote Aryan Germans. This people's car, as it would be known, was to be priced at somewhere between 700 and 1,000 Reichsmark, which was the equivalent of about 4 months of the average worker's salary. Now, needless to say, part of the reason that cars are not widely available for people, especially at this ridiculously low price in the 1930s, is that the market wouldn't bear it out. It costs too much to build a car at this point, to offer it for those kind of rates. So what the Nazis decide is that rather than relying on the market to supply it, or rather than even subsidizing private companies to do it, they were going to produce the cars through the government itself. And so what Hitler does is charge an organization called the German Labor Front, or the DAF, Deutsche Arbeitsfront, with this task of building Volkswagens. Now, the DAF was a Nazi governmental organization that was formed in 1933 in order to replace the outlawed German labor unions. Theoretically, it is pitched as a kind of successor to the unions, but the idea is that it's not going to engage in kind of hardcore wage bargaining, always trying to secure more rights, better salaries, these strikes that interfere with the functioning of the economy. The idea of a Nazi labor union is that it's going to work alongside management for the good of the nation, and so they're all going to agree on everything, and everything will be perfect for workers. Unfortunately for the leaders of the DAF, it is quickly made apparent to them that actually, no, that the DAF is not going to be involved in negotiating pay, working conditions. As we'll talk about in another episode, the Nazis, even by the summer of 1933, they're already thinking the goal is rearmament, and anything that interferes with rearmament is a bad thing, is a problem, and we're not going to allow it. And so what the DAF essentially becomes is an organization that is focused on workers' social and cultural welfare. It is going to start thinking about how do we impact the lives of ordinary workers in not necessarily even material ways, but in cultural and social ways to make their lives better. So to connect this again with the idea of cars, the DAF begins advertising the idea of the Volkswagen. We haven't produced it yet, we're working on it, but you can start reserving your copy or your car, if you will, by making a small installment payment every week. If you pay just 5 Reichsmarks per week, then you can make the dream of owning an automobile seem well within reach. If I said to you, okay, you have a minimum wage job, you don't have access to a credit card, you want to buy the newest iPhone, which I don't even know how much these new phones cost today because, they come up with all these schemes and ways of doing it, but, they can cost up to $1,000. If you're working a minimum wage job, if you're living off of food stamps here in the United States, how are you going to afford an iPhone? We say, okay, just pay $5 a week. Just pay $5 a week. You can pay it off over the course of years, but eventually you're going to get your iPhone, and I guess in this analogy, it would be a new iPhone when you bought it. That suddenly makes the idea of owning an automobile seem possible, seem within reach. And for over 300,000 Germans, this represented an avenue to getting a car, and they bought in, and they started taking out these subscriptions with the understanding that one day, yes, the dream would become real. And so even though people, we have this sense of instant gratification, we want what we want when we want it, which is usually right this second, the idea of acquiring something over the course of time, this was something that was very attractive to many people in Nazi Germany, right? Here is this thing. If I said, you can get a luxury yacht, you can't have it today, but if you start paying this small amount now and it's going to be at a super discounted price and you can get it 5 years from now, would I pay $10 a week to get a super yacht? Yeah, sure, I'll do that. Or a sailboat even, like a nice sailboat. I'll pay for that, and I'll start to dream about it. And I'll start to think that the dream is real. Now, to build these new cars, in June 1934, Hitler turned to Ferdinand Porsche, a well-known auto engineer and future Nazi Party and SS member. If you know anything about the history of automobiles, of course, if I say the name Porsche, you think about super fast luxury cars, right? You don't think about basic economy cars. But Porsche was a big supporter of the Nazis, and he was the one that actually began work to design this first Volkswagen car, which would become known as the KDF-Wagen. Wagen in German essentially means car, right? So it's the first KDF car. It is essentially, and I'm saying essentially here, not directly, but it is essentially the forerunner to the Volkswagen Beetle. If you've ever seen images of the Beetle from especially the 1960s, the Beetle is not super fast. The Beetle is not, the luxury car. It doesn't have all the gadgets and gizmos, and it doesn't have a spoiler. It's not souped up. It's not meant to be a status symbol. Indeed, the Volkswagen is supposed to be kind of a cheaper car, the Beetle, that is available to lots of people, that can be produced cheaply. And so again, the Nazis come up with this idea of the KDF-Wagen. It's essentially a forerunner to the classic Volkswagen Beetle. To build this vehicle, the Nazis borrowed heavily from the ideas of the American industrialist Henry Ford. Now, of course, if you know anything about Henry Ford, not only was Henry Ford a tremendous innovator, an incredible businessman, he's involved in actually the founding of several car companies, but his real claim to fame is the idea of the assembly line, right? I am going to rationalize production in order to bring down costs, in order to create maximum efficiency in terms of construction. Henry Ford, by the way, is also a huge anti-Semite. He is someone who is a huge enthusiast for Nazi Germany and for Hitler. He actually wins an award before the outbreak of war in World War II from the Nazi government. And so there's kind of this interesting mesh there of ideology and business acumen. And so the Nazis decide, hey, we want to build something kind of like Henry Ford's River Rouge plant, which is completed in 1928. The River Rouge plant is this massive factory that is going to kind of implement the assembly line for the production of Ford cars. And in May 1937, the Nazis begin building their own version of this River Rouge plant, which is going to be about 1.3 kilometers long and is eventually going to include an entire city to house the workforce that is going to build these automobiles. In 1945, this newly built town became known as Wolfsburg, and Wolfsburg is today the headquarters of Volkswagen in Germany. Now, as I said a little bit ago, the production of the KDF-Wagen never actually became reality. By the time the plant was nearing completion in 1939, Germany was already deeply invested in preparations for World War II. Many of the machines needed to build cars were initially used elsewhere. And when these machines were acquired by the factory in 1940, they were used to build Jeeps, aircraft parts, and eventually V-1 rockets. Now, interestingly, many of these machines would actually survive World War II, and their existence became a key part of German, or at least West German, post-war recovery. Not to give away too much of the game, but the Allied bombing campaign actually doesn't destroy that much in terms of Germany's industrial capacity. And so once they get money from the Marshall Plan, they're able to kind of restart everything and re-enter production, and the economy explodes in the early to mid-1950s. But anyways, here I just want to note again the way that Hitler used the dream of owning an automobile to build enthusiasm for his dictatorship. For the 300,000 Germans who sent in that 5 Reichsmarks every week, the story of Nazi Germany, at least again before the outbreak of war in 1939, the story is not the idea of, oh, I lost my political rights, oh, I might end up in a concentration camp, oh, I've lost my freedom. Instead, it is the idea that by owning a car, Hitler is putting you on the path towards eventual freedom. Now, the Volkswagen was just one of many Nazi programs that helped Germans feel empowered in the Nazi dictatorship. Before I get into detail about more of them, I want to spend a moment discussing something called the Volksgemeinschaft, which basically translates to the people's community, or as some historians like Shelley Baranowski refer to it, the racial community. Now, obviously, when we think about the idea of Nazi community, the idea of racial communities or racial conceptions of communities, we obviously, and for good reason, focus on their exclusive properties. The way Nazi racism tends to say, for example, that people like Jews or the disabled or Roma, that they are divided from the idea of the national racial community. That said, the Nazi idea of community was still a sense of community. And for those who are understood as healthy or Aryan, it promised to overcome long-standing divisions of class and confession that had long divided Germans from one another. If you go back to the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, the question of whether you are Protestant or Catholic in German society is far, far more consequential than whether or not you're Jewish. There is a long history of violence between those two communities, and then even towards the end of the 19th century, there's political repression against Catholics. The idea of class conflict as being something that is divisive is really at the core, one could argue, of 19th century German history, or at least it is something that it is an anxiety that is really preoccupying political authorities, be it in the Wilhelmine era, during World War I, during Weimar, etc. And so while we obviously want to highlight, and we will discuss in further detail in another episode, the exclusive nature of Nazi racial community, we should also recognize that a key part of the appeal of Nazi ideology was the idea that everyone from the ordinary factory worker to the elite banker would abandon their narrow personal interests and put the needs of the community as a whole in the forefront. If you think about politics in many countries around the world today, I'm here in the United States, this is certainly true, but it's also true in places like France, like Belgium, like Germany today, like the UK. Political identities have become really important. Societies are very divided. It's very contentious. And there is a kind of longing for unity, a nostalgia for this feeling of when we were all on the same page and we all agreed and we didn't get into big food fights at Thanksgiving because you and your uncle have different political views. Imagine if for a second we could just put all those things behind us and all come together again. It's not hard to see why this message of unity and inclusion within the Nazi idea of community would have been appealing to some people. Now, as we've discussed before, the Nazis essentially thought of the nation as a biological organism. People, ordinary people, were in this sense cells in the larger body. The Führer, or the leader, was the kind of mind or conscience of the nation. And just as in your body, the individual cells were supposed to kind of follow the mind of the nation as a whole. The individual cells in your body are not supposed to pursue their own means. They're supposed to kind of follow along. In fact, when cells start thinking for themselves and operating on their own behalf, we actually call these cancer. It's what cancer is. It's your body's cells kind of making cells that don't listen to the body as a whole anymore. So this notion of obedience is very baked into Nazi ideals of community, as was the concept of self-sacrifice. This is true in many fascist countries. This is the idea that men have to be ready to serve as soldiers, that they need to be ready to die for the nation as a whole, so that the folk, or so that the nation can live, so that it can secure resources, especially if you think about the world in this kind of social Darwinistic way. We're fighting over limited resources. If we want to survive or even expand or thrive, we need to control all those resources. So men are supposed to be soldiers. Men are supposed to die or be ready to die. Women, on the other side, are supposed to be mothers. women in the fascist concept are literally responsible for raising the next generation, for procreating, for raising not just sort of biologically, but then kind of educating kids in order to keep the nation healthy and to keep it kind of reproducing. Now, for obvious reasons, many of these notions probably strike us as a little traditional, perhaps even outdated. The point I want to make here, however, is that the idea of the Volksgemeinschaft, or the people's community, went beyond only the idea of duty and sacrifice. To put it kind of another way, it is the idea that the sense of duty goes both ways. It is not only the job of people to sacrifice for the nation, as the Nazis understood it, also had to look out for the welfare of the people, just as you look out for the welfare of your body. Your conscience may not be exclusively focused on, hey, what is it that my liver cells want today? But it's not oblivious to the needs and desires of the liver cells either, right? It wants all of the cells in the body to be healthy, and so it's going to look out for them. When it comes to the idea of welfare, the Nazis are concerned about all of the people, or at least in theory, as long as you're in the inner group, the inner community, the Nazis are concerned about the welfare of all of the people, not just the elite, not just the constituencies that they quote unquote represent. Now, of course, we're also talking about theory here. In practice, things can be a little bit different, but in terms of Nazi ideology, the idea of the Volksgemeinschaft is that we are all in this together. And this goes beyond just the sense of welfare as, are we meeting your basic needs? Do the ordinary people, the plebes as we sometimes call them, do the plebes have enough to eat? Are they getting basic sanitation? Are they not dying in massive, epidemics? Then great, fine, we'll go worry about the things that we're really worried about. We just care about this basic level of subsistence. The Nazis understand the idea of social welfare beyond this level. They understand it as a qualitative point. The idea that not only are people surviving, but are they happy? Are they enjoying their lives? Do they find fulfillment in the roles that they have in society? Whether that's being a banker or an industrialist, or whether it's being a factory worker or a coal miner. And so again, part of realizing the people's community here is not just about obedience, although that is an important part of it, but it is also about personal empowerment and satisfaction and freedom, not in a legal sense, but in an experiential sense, as we talked about at the beginning of the episode. And so to fulfill this promise, the Nazis create a variety of social welfare programs that are designed to bring a sense of the good life to ordinary people. Now, when I say social welfare, perhaps a lot of your first thoughts are about the modern social welfare programs in the United States, things like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. These are kind of like the big three. We also have things like SNAP, which is essentially food stamps. There's disability insurance that you can get, or income that the government will provide you with. In Europe, we have things like universal health care. We have subsidized higher education. We have unemployment insurance, pension benefits. Right, and so especially after World War II, states have set up these kind of robust social welfare programs with the understanding that they will kind of prevent major catastrophes that could lead you to radicalism. In other words, if you lose your job, if you are someone that comes from a poor background, right, and you want to become an astrophysicist, how are you going to be able to afford university? How are you going to be able to afford medical bills, right? We don't want that to kind of ruin your life because theoretically that's not something you had any control over. So a lot of modern state-run welfare programs are focused on economics, or what we might call economic welfare. They're designed essentially, again, to kind of mitigate or eliminate these types of circumstances that can permanently disrupt your life, right? That can limit your access to a basic level of economic prosperity. Again, to give a concrete example, your 70-year-old grandmother or grandfather, they're probably not going to go work in a coal mine. They're probably not going to be able to work a factory job anymore. So the theory is, let's give them a minimum level of income so that they don't starve, so that they have access to health care. Because why would you want to insure an older person? Because obviously older people get sick more often, older people consume more healthcare resources. So market-wise, it's not the best way to approach the idea of, making sure, again, grandma or grandpa has healthcare. This, again, is what especially European and American social welfare programs are focused on after World War II. And part of the basic idea here is keep people out of poverty, not just for moral reasons, but because if people are in poverty, they become radical and they want to burn the system down, and we don't want to do that. Now, regardless of how you feel about these social welfare programs today, it's important to note here that the Nazi idea of social welfare and Volksgemeinschaft is very different. Rather than being primarily about money, Nazi social welfare programs focused more on the psychological needs of the people rather than solely their economic sort of status. For the Nazis, the idea of empowerment was not something that was to be indirectly achieved through managing the market or creating an environment where improving conditions bring kind of prosperity to all. Rather, what the Nazis want to do is intervene directly through targeted programs in order to make people feel that their lives are getting better. Not to get too much into the bigger kind of cultural picture here, but there is a long-standing kind of current in German society that wants to distinguish what is German versus that crass American materialism where they would say it's soulless, all you want to do is shop and acquire kind of these cheap kind of goods. And that's not really a path to happiness, they would argue. There's no culture in there. There's no meat there. And so the Nazis will tap into this and try to create, again, an alternative to this idea that material gain and consumption will lead to happiness. Now, again, just to kind of finish the thought here, I will say again that this idea of community is based on a racialized notion of community. It has these kind of strong ideological sinews or flavors or kind of elements that are binding it together and giving it kind of a purpose. However, we should also note that there is a practical side to this Nazi argument of don't get wrapped up in consumer goods, let's go out and hike in the woods, and that'll be a much better form of freedom for you. Again, one of the things that is happening in parallel to this is the Nazi program of rearmament. And rearmament means we are going to suck up a lot of the steel, a lot of the raw materials, a lot of the disposable foreign currencies that we need to go buy and import goods. So because so much of the kind of economic lifeblood, if you will, the raw materials, the resources, because they're going into building tanks and airplanes and bullets and things like that, you don't really have a lot left over for the domestic production of consumer goods. And you don't want to be importing large amounts of consumer goods because then you're going to lose the foreign currencies that you have. So the Nazis focus more on experiences and culture rather than physical items for economic reasons as well. As the historian Shelley Baranowski has described it, these social welfare programs, and in particular the Kraftwerk-Freude, which I'll talk about in a second, these, quote, strove to open the cultural practices of the middle and upper classes to workers, thus ameliorating their quality of life while compensating for wage freezes, longer working hours, and the restrictions on private consumption, end quote. Rather than getting bogged down in the classical economic debate about guns versus butter. If you ever took Econ 101 in high school or college, you know about this debate about guns versus butter. You have to pick one or the other. The Nazis go all in on the guns, and they say, instead of butter, why don't you do tourism? Why don't you go for a hike in the woods? Why don't you swim in the pool? This will be much better. Okay, this will conclude the first half of our lecture on Nazism and social welfare. To hear the second half, where we discuss things like the Strength Through Joy program or Kraft durch Freude and several other Nazi social welfare programs, look for episode 48B, which should be released about 2 weeks after this one is. So sorry if that causes any inconvenience, but again, I didn't want to supersize the episode. That's going to be it for now. We hope you join us next time as we take history off the page.